Julianne and Ray Wynn. My question is based on my background as a teacher, banker, and business consultant. Corporations are held accountable. You both said that or implied it. In AGMs where shareholders can ask questions, and in AGMs, it's held accountable by shareholders. In AGMs, shareholders can ask questions of its leaders, directors, and questions concerning or also making comments. They can also use financial statements, annual reports to ask questions or criticize the corporation's performance and its standing. My question, two of them. So how are universities held accountable? And how can universities be held accountable? How are they held accountable, and how can they be held accountable?
That's a very good question. Universities used to be held accountable to Parliament. Universities are set up under state acts, legislation of the state Parliament. They still produce, technically, an annual report, but that's just, really a farce. But there is embedded there, in the history of universities, that notion that they are accountable to the public and to the representatives of the public, and that's how it still should be. I think we need, democratic accountability measures, methods. I don't know very much about how exactly one does that, but certainly some kind of mechanism of accountability to the students and staff on the spot, and to the wider public that the university is supposed to serve.
Anything on this? George, do you know anything on this?
On accountability?
But George may be able to help later. But as far as I know, the emergence of the corporate structure has not come with that level of accountability that you're asking for, and I don't think that it's happening at all in any profound way. It's just emerged. The split has happened. It used to be a collegiate body, and now it's management versus the rest of the university. And as you say, there should be an accountability process that has not actually been formed. And as Raywin says, state government is, kind of hands off. People think of it as a federal. They don't seem to be accountable to the students, because more and more you're finding the students having bigger classes, and the only thing that seems to be dictating is the bottom line. And we have to remember that these aren't profit-making institutions. I've been in meetings where the accountant has said, well, the profit, and I've said, excuse me, if it's anything, it's a surplus. It's not a profit. And I'm having to point this out to people who are working in the sector. So it just, we do need more accountability.
The question is, why not take these people on at their own game? They want privatisation, and they're exploiting the people who have knowledge. You people have the knowledge. They want knowledge. Atlas shrugged. Why don't you shrug them off? They need you more than you need them. Why don't you start forming your own small boutique universities and starting with BA in literature? Then you can have control. You can set the fees, and that is, you talk about no change without change. That is a change they'd sit up and take notice of. So the question is, why not take them on at there?
I actually was part of a group which did this in half a century ago. It was called the Free University. It wasn't as substantial as what perhaps you're suggesting. That is, it didn't actually have salaries or permanent staff. But there is a lot of experimentation going on. has been in the past, is now. The New School for Social Research, for instance, in New York, which is now a fairly neoliberal university, started out actually as a socialist experiment in progressive education. So there's a lot of experimentation going on a small scale. The problem is not the lack of ideas or willingness to try, but the difficulty of how do you scale that up? How do you get reform at the level of the whole society or the whole higher education sector? And that's where I'm still somewhat at a loss, I have to say, as to know how to do that. But something like the Free University in Melbourne, the Free University in Brisbane, that's was running some classes in a garage. They're very promising. Sorry.
Well, partly because as speaking as a casual academic, we're too busy trying to secure 14 weeks worth of work at a time, and we're not organised in the way. I mean, a lot of us are union members, but that doesn't mean that we are invited to seminars. We don't even get invited to seminars. We get hot desks. We don't get parking permits. We don't get any of those sorts of things. So we're a disparate lot, and we might catch up for a drink once a semester. Now, for us to then find the time, I mean, I work, get home from one job, start marking, spend my whole weekend marking, preparing for classes, and then, do this week in, week out. It's very hard when we're all doing that to organise in the way that you're talking about. We have ideas over a drink, and then we go our separate ways. So much and all as I would love to be able to do something like that. The practicalities of it, given that we have no space, no offices, no nothing, not even a conversation in the corridor, which is where a lot of these ideas can really bear fruit. And so it's very difficult to do what you're doing. In utopia, we may manage it.
George Morgan, Western Sydney University. Just a plug for the Free University of Western Sydney, which started a couple of months ago and meets every month or so in the Bankstown Arts Centre, and is meeting next Monday evening. It's a very lively and very well attended gathering, so that's the first thing to point out. Just on the question or the curse of casualisation we both spoke of, one of the things that doesn't come through in the kind of large-scale figures that we get is not only that half of university teaching is now being done by casuals, but that the patterning of casualisation across university offerings is very uneven. So that in those areas where people have viable career alternatives, income generating alternatives outside the academy, they will not accept being put on the treadmill of the casual labour market for years and years on end. But in the humanities and social sciences, where PhD graduates abound, where there are few career options outside the academy, there's gross exploitation and very, very high levels of casualisation. The other consequence of that is that you've got a kind of basically a roadblock, a career structure roadblock, where people are not getting their first tenure jobs till they're 45. And it means increasingly that the people who are running universities are coming from a narrower and narrower range of disciplines. They're climbing the ladder very quickly, thank you very much, if they're from, accountancy or law, but if they're from philosophy or anthropology or sociology, there's no quick way up the ladder. And so if you look back at the Vice-Chancellor's of Australian universities 25 years ago, there were quite a few from geography, from literature, from history, from various disciplines. But if you look at the backgrounds of the senior managers of Australian universities now, they are more and more from that very narrow range of professional disciplines. And it means that when they come to confront their corporate boards, they are much more in line with the corporate way of thinking. The people who have traditionally been the custodians of the liberal democratic ideal of higher education are no longer part of the managerial class where they once were, and hence collegiality is disappearing. I guess I should ask a question, and the question is, I'm wondering what you both think of the kind of consequence of the Vice-Chancellors of Australia, almost all of them siding with the deregulation agenda. Whether you feel we've reached a point where university managements have lost the legitimacy they may have once had, and whether we can expect potentially a future Labor government to look beyond that narrow managerial class in order to get a direction for higher education in the future.
Yeah, well, we very much hope so. And it's not as if there, are no resources. As I've said, really interesting discussions on higher education have been going on, sponsored by the union. Sometimes cooperatively between the union and one of the universities. Sometimes directly in union meetings and contexts. But much more widely, of course, there's now a large resource of people who have worked in the sector, some of whom have moved out of it, some of whom, like me, have reached the end of a career but are still fairly functional, and there's a considerable body of experience and capability there that could be drawn on. So we're not exactly short of alternative resources, but the point you make about the narrowing recruitment and most of all the narrowing minds of university managers is very, very important.
We don't know what Labor's going to do, as they seem to be getting rid of Kim Carr. My colleagues from NAPU and I have been down to visit Kim Carr and were incredibly encouraged by his attitude to university management, who he thought were a bunch of right-wing nutters. Don't quote. That's not a quote. But yes, he certainly thought that they were taking the wrong approach to the governing of universities, and was certainly incredibly encouraging on how he thought universities should be run. But as I say, we don't know who the opposition Minister for Education is going to be. But what we do know, I think, is that the governing structures at the moment are hitting unacceptable in most institutions, and that people are really disturbed by what's going on. I can tell you at Sydney University right now, if you mention the strategic plan to most people across the sector, you get the same response. You get a person opening their mouths and raising two fingers to their throat. They just go, that's all. That's what they think of it. They're disgusted by the strategic plan. Now, whether the fight back is going to happen soon, I don't know, but we really do need a counter to it, and I can't see it happening under the current government. It will have to happen in a future government if it's going to come from the government itself.
The first part, seeing that education is becoming a commodity and is seeing a far more greater corporatisation of higher education. Firstly, since we've got a lot of lawyers out there, and most of Canberra seems to be run by lawyers, firstly, do students have the right to ask for their money back if they don't get what they guaranteed or told in the prospectus or what's being advertised, to show a bit of accountability back to management? And secondly, apart from crises, for example in the US, a large part of the innovation coming out from universities is often happening in areas that are people that are broadly trained and have an environment where they can actually have a collegial sort of environment rather than run by the dollar. The dollar follows them, not the other way around. What would it take for management or the leaders to actually start realising that that has to be reversed? Otherwise, when you're really vulnerable, what you have to fall back on is actually a bankrupt system rather than actually a system that actually has ideas and is a seed for the future.
Anyone from Sydney College of the Arts? Okay, Sydney College of the Arts, as you may or may not know, has they're threatening to amalgamate Sydney College of the Arts, which is part of the University of Sydney, with COFA, which is part of UNSW. And there are students who went to an open day and were told, yes, you can study, you can graduate with us at the University of Sydney. And there are, not sure how many, 80 at last count, students who are saying, actually, you've sold me a lie. And they are considering taking the university to court over the fact that they were promised the opportunity to graduate from the University of Sydney with a fine arts degree, and now they're suddenly to be amalgamated with UNSW. So this may be a tipping point. It may, I don't know, but it's certainly something that is. Someone was talking earlier about shareholders, stakeholders, whatever you like to call them. These students are actually trying to make the university accountable.
Way back in 1971, when my dad, who was a professor of medieval history, was addressing the arts school, he said to the 400 assembled 17-year-olds, including me, if you think that this has anything whatsoever to do with getting you a better job, you may leave now. And of course nobody left. But the point is that for him to say that, it's something almost unsayable now. He was in effect saying, this has nothing to do with the corporate agenda. This has nothing to do with getting you a better job. Now, where does that leave me if, for example, I want to study, say, the philosophy of Ramanuja, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Sanskrit and ancient Greek drama, and the meaning of life, which are all the things that are sort of interesting to me, apart from trying to save the planet from incineration.
Well, if you want to study the meaning of life, what you should do is go to TAFE, except it's not there anymore.
Management,
That's right. That's yeah. It's a fundamentally, it's a very fundamental issue of what basically a university is for. Now, I mean, of course, we live in history, and the historical situation in the 1960s, when I was an undergraduate, and even in the 1970s, and today is different. Like, it was a full employment economy. I didn't actually need to worry about whether I would get a job or not. Everybody had a reasonable expectation that they would. So what happens in universities is interwoven, with the growth of managerial power and the retreat of the state, or the shifting character of the state at any rate. These are also part of our equation, but that very fundamental question, where do you go if you want to study the Dead Sea Scrolls, think about the meaning of life, where will the next generation be able to do this thinking? Underneath a Moreton Bay fig? Good, but the government is cutting down on the Moreton Bay figs.
Look, I think that what's happened in Australia is a reflection of our tall poppy syndrome, perhaps. If you studied ancient history in the UK, and as someone I know of did honours thesis on bronze axe heads or arrowheads or something in archaeology, the world would be their oyster. You know, if you get a first, whatever job you apply for, you will get in. Here, if you get a first in philosophy or archaeology or something like that, you may end up as a barista. You know, our problem is that the organisations that our students are potential employers for don't respect the incredible skills that our students acquire while they're writing a history essay. They don't get it. They don't see that you know, that level of thinking, their capacity to write, the analysis, the research, all that could transfer just as easily to a corporate setting as it has to their university essay. So it's not, I don't think it's the students going in and you know, choosing a degree in arts that are the problem, and that, you know, they should be wondering how this is going to get me a job. It's the organisations who need to rethink their employees. And I think post the global financial crisis, some of these organisations are going, you know what, it was the kids from the business schools that got us into this problem. Let's diversify and bring in some other students. And we're finding that some of our students are actually finding positions in these organisations because they need the diversity of you know, critical thinking and a bright intellect.
I am always helped with such an important issue in knowing how does it compare with comparable countries coming out of the Western system. So the three countries I'm thinking of is, number one is the United Kingdom, number two Canada, number three New Zealand. Is it basically the same process happening there to a greater extent, to a lesser extent, or about the same as Australia? Is there a distinctive difference between what's happening here and those three, what we call Commonwealth countries, UK, Canada and New Zealand, but particularly the United Kingdom?
It's a fair question. It is, of course, difficult to make those comparisons, and Britain is in a much more central position in the global academic industry than Australia is. We're very much marginal in it. But I read the research on internal processes within universities, and they're totally recognisable. Some of the policy moves in the United Kingdom have, since the mid-1990s, I guess, have actually seemed more radically neoliberal than what's happened in Australia. There may be a certain drag of the federal structure in Australia on this as on other issues, but the way colleagues in New Zealand talk about their experience is very much like what you would hear on an Australian campus too. If you look a little more widely at places that I think are in certain ways more comparable to Australia than, say, Britain, for instance, in Brazil, you have a very curious situation which is worth thinking about, where something like 70% of university enrolments in Brazil are now in private universities, not public universities at all. And curiously, it's working class and lower middle class students who go to the private universities in Brazil, and the public universities are the ones which have a kind of privileged social intake. It's really quite paradoxical and different, say, from the United States, but is perhaps an indication of what might have happened in Australia if Dawkins had not pushed through the amalgamation, the abolition of the two tiers, and demanded a single system. We might have had something that looked more like that.
Yeah, a concern I'd like to raise is something which has been touched on, but not in great detail yet, and that's about the whole tainting of university work through aspects such as corporate money coming in, and particularly in terms of research and even issues like making public findings of research. Such an example happened at Sydney University last year with the Veterinary Science Department, where some research was done into different pet foods and finding which ones were potentially harmful to pets and which ones were okay and so on. And Sydney Uni was saying that they weren't going to release findings, it was going to remain confidential. So my question, I guess, is just about that whole aspect of commercial sort of tainting of university work and so on, and what sort of direction that's going in, and what sort of things can be done.
That's a very troubling issue, and part of what I was sort of trying to gesture at when I was talking about the way universities are backing away from the concept of truth. And the difficulty of establishing truth is, very central to research practice. You need time, you need resources if you're going to make a real advance in knowledge. And as public funding of universities has declined and universities have become more and more dependent on other sources, one of them is corporate money, including corporate research money. And that scenario I suggested, where universities would become vocational schools plus corporate research institutes, is sort of seeing what might become if that continued. In fact, Australia is not very badly infected with direct corruption of research, I think, because we're so marginal. Australia produces only about 3% of the world's research publications. We are really very small beer. And if you're going to corrupt a research field, you really need to do it in Europe and North America, which of course the corporations do. So there's now, especially in biomedical research that affects the products of pharmaceutical companies, there's tremendous angst among researchers about the trustworthiness of findings, about the extent to which negative findings are never reported, or even null findings where you actually don't find an effect either way fails to get reported. There's now a very lively debate going on about the reproducibility of research findings, about the implicit biases produced by funding. It's a lively issue, especially in the biomedical field.
With the neoliberalisation and corporatisation of higher education, our power holders have systematically fenced, stratified, enclosed or privatised the Republic of Knowledge to the point where there is no longer any public or popular ownership of science and human knowledge. Do you think that the growth of an anti-science bias and the dangerous success of the climate change deniers is at least partly due to this? And in accordance with the Tweedledee and Tweedledum theory, we have the Liberals arguing for a policy of open slather deregulation and the Labor Party blithely accepting the system of student debt and the marketisation and commodification of university access. Both of the major parties accept a system that locks students into massive debt and corporatises the university sector. And yet, 40 years ago, on the 1st of January 1974, Gough Whitlam introduced free university education. Education is a right, not a privilege. It is a social good, not a cost. countries like Germany, Norway and Finland have moved back to the free education model. Why can't we? And what will it take?
Okay. Look, our scientists are on the money. They know what's happening with climate change. What's happening, unfortunately, is the media, under pressure from Conservative government, seems to feel the need to give half time to nutters, climate skeptics on things like the ABC. So, look, you know, our scientists are doing the right thing. They're not being respected is the problem. Look, there are so many science communicators out there. The people are trying to get the message out there, but it's not getting the coverage because it's not what organisations like what do they call Murdoch want. They don't want it. They'd rather scaremonger and make people believe that this is all nonsense and it's all some left-wing conspiracy. So, I wouldn't blame the scientists, I would blame the media, and I don't think it's the university's fault. They are really, they do have their science communicators trying to get the message out there.
It's at least an issue that we need to worry about. I'm a little bit encouraged by the research on the credibility of different sources of information, which, if I remember rightly, shows universities still fairly well respected and the Murdoch media right at the bottom of judgments of credibility of sources of information. So there's a certain public scepticism about the particular kind of propaganda we get from News Limited. But yet I think you're right. There is a kind of crisis around the credibility of established sources of knowledge and concepts of truth. I would even see that as one of the factors that's led into Brexit and the Trump campaign. There's a certain cultural scepticism that those guys are picking up on and turning to, quasi-fascist purposes. So the issue is a real one, and I don't think it will be will regain ground unless we couple that with movement on the second point you rose, which is the loss of the sense of education as a public good. And if in the agitational work that I do around this issue, that is an absolutely central theme. That we must re-establish the notion of education at all levels, and I mean school as much as university, as something which doesn't produce as its main product individual separate advantage. It produces collective advantage through the existence of common educational processes. And that applies in a very specific way, but it applies very strongly to higher education too. And I think there is still a good deal of cultural support for those ideas, that they are not getting, as you rightly say, much articulated through the political system or the mass media. Cool. Thank you.